Good morning, everyone, or I'm sorry, good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock, and welcome to our student webinar today, World War II Innovation and Problem Solving. And before we get started, y'all know I like to do a quick technology review, so I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen with you so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So what you're seeing is what your window should look like, or it should look very similar to what you're seeing on the screen now. And there are two very important things I want to highlight. The first one is that box that looks kind of like a little piece of paper. That's our handout section. So before this webinar, I did send to all registrants a copy of the teacher guide, and that includes a really good essay that was written by Rob here, and also some post-visit activities. So if you didn't receive that, if you maybe registered a little late, or some of the emails bounced back to me because I think they might have been typed in wrong in the registration form. If you didn't receive that, go ahead and click on the handouts box and you can download a copy of that now. You can also email me after the webinar if you forget to do that before this is over, and I can email a copy to you. The second big thing I want to point out is the question section. And this is actually what we're going to use for you all to communicate with us. So anytime we ask a question, if you have a response, we would love for you to type it in the ask a question box. If you want to ask a question of us, you can type that in there as well. And we also have someone behind the scenes who's helping us with all of our technology inquiries. So if you're having any issues with your connection, you can type those into that box as well, and she will assist you to the best of her abilities. But I can say the best way to have the GoToWebinar software run is to make sure that you have any extra windows on your computer closed out. And should you have issues, I know everybody hates hearing this, it's like the broken record from IT departments, but usually if you turn your computer off or restart your computer, or simply log out of the GoToWebinar app and log back in, that usually solves any issues that you may come across. But again, any questions, go ahead and type them into that ask a question box. And I didn't introduce today's guest here, but this is actually Rob Wallace, and he is our STEM specialist here at the National World War II Museum. He knows all things science and engineering and technology. Thank you for joining us today, Rob.
I'm really super excited to be here.
Yes, thank you. And we're really excited about combining these two topics, the history, the social studies, and also that science that was used in World War II. But are you ready to get started?
Ready.
Okay, so we want to start first with this question that I'm going to throw up on your screens now. And I apologize, my computer is moving very slowly today. But the question is, what can we learn from how people solved problems in the past? And teachers, I would like for you to get answers from your students. And again, you can go ahead and type these into that question box because we would like to hear some of their responses and read some of them live. And right now, it looks like we're having some responses come into us. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at those. So we have some 8th grade students who said, we can learn from people's mistakes. That's a really...
Mistakes are a very important way that scientists and engineers learn. You can't, if you don't make mistakes, you don't learn.
Yes, I agree. We always learn from our mistakes. And let's see, we have another class that said, we can learn how technology has changed over time.
Yep.
And we're actually going to talk about some changes of technology next. We have another group that is saying we can see how society has changed. That's a really great answer because as societies change, so are the things that these societies are using.
Yeah, their technologies tell you about the problems they were trying to solve. So by looking at their technologies, you could tell what kind of things they were trying to do.
Yeah. And let's see, we have another one. We can evolve through engineering. That's a good answer. Yeah. And we have another one coming in that says, we can see how people adapted to their environments. That's another really good one. These were great responses. Thank y'all so much for sending these in. The next slide I want to show you, these are actually some objects that may be familiar to you because we know that we can learn so many things from how people solve problems in the past. But when we're talking about World War II, we can also see how people use scientific inquiry to make modifications to objects in order to make them useful for the war effort. And Rob, what does that word modification actually mean?
So when you take something and you test it and then you change it based on the results of your testing. So that's how scientists and engineers, especially engineers, work through this circular process. You make something, you test it out, and you improve it.
And I've actually put 3 modification examples up on the screen here. And I chose these 3 things because I felt like they would be pretty familiar to students. So I want to start with the biggest one, the most colorful one. They're in the middle. And those are actually track shoes. And Rob, can you tell us what the modification is here?
Yeah, that's a shoe from 1968. It was the first shoe that used Velcro as a closure, and they were used in the 1968 Olympics by American athletes.
And why was this modification so important?
Well, I mean, if you're a sprinter or a runner, you don't want to trip over your laces as they come undone. You know, you can see they've got spikes on them. Those are pretty intense shoes. So if you're doing a high jump or you're going over the hurdles, you know, you want your shoes on really tight. You want to be able to maybe change them fast. So the Velcro closures were an adaptation for those purposes.
And these shoes actually have a World War II connection. These are actually made by the Puma company, which is a German company. There were 2 brothers who owned a shoe company in Germany, and not that long after the war ended, they actually had some infighting and they split up into 2 separate companies. So Puma and another one y'all may be familiar with, Adidas. Okay, let's take a look at the object on the right-hand side of these shoes, and that is a ballpoint pen. So Rob, can you talk to us about the modification here?
So back at that time, they called that a biro pen. It was a ballpoint pen, and they called it a biro pen because during World War II, a Hungarian guy named Biro figured out how to make a ballpoint pen. Now, the oldest pens were reeds that the Egyptians put ink in and wrote on papyrus. And in later years, people used pens, like you see in Harry Potter, they use a quill, but you have to dip it in the ink, right? And then they made steel pens also that you had to dip in the ink. They made a modification to that called a fountain pen, where you still had that little nib of a pen, but you carried the ink along with you. That was called a fountain pen. But those have a habit of blowing up in your pocket and making a big mess, ruining your shirts and your pants. So that was a big problem. So the ballpoint pen is all enclosed. There's no leakage. And so it was really a big innovation. If you're in an airplane and you're a pilot and you've got to add notes to a map, you know, you can't be dipping your pen in ink, you know. So it was a big innovation for World War II. Now, of course, today, you know, there are all these fancy pens that we use, but they're pretty much all just different versions of ballpoint pens.
And I have to say, I am biased. I think that this is the most important one that we have up on the screen for my life, because y'all can't see my desk right now, but I probably have about 30 pens all over the place. Rob can see them. I love pens. I'm a pen obsessed person too. I am a pen collector. All right, let's take a look at the last object that I know all of you students are very familiar with, and this is a smartphone. Rob, can you tell us what the modification is here?
Well, it sits on a long line of modifications. I mean, the first iPhone was amazing, you know, and I have an iPhone 8 now, and people complain that it's not different enough to be cool. But you know, you think about like how much that has changed. And so the first iPhone was really just an iPod, a music player, and a phone stuck together. But if you go all the way back, if you guys have seen an old movie, I'm not talking old like I was a kid, I'm talking old like it was old to me. You know, see those phones where you talk into it and you go hang the thing up, you know, and you have to ask the operator to call a number for you. And then later we dial with a rotary, and then there's the cordless phones at home, and, you know, and flip phones. So the first cell phones, you know, in the cars, they were huge.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a constant string of modifications, and every time, you know, we build one better. But the thing is like we think about innovation as a brand new, came from nowhere sort of thing, and it's not really. It's usually something that we've modified.
And another really great thing about the smartphone modification is that now it's not just a phone. Now it's like having a computer in your purse or in your pocket.
Yeah, before a lot of people don't remember this because they're not old like me, but there used to be a thing called a Palm Pilot, and it didn't have a phone in it, but it did all that other stuff. It had maps in it, and it organized everything for you. It had your calendar, but it didn't have a phone.
Thank you, Rob. So now that we've kind of discussed what modification is, and we've looked at some examples that we're familiar with when it comes to modification, I want to move on to the 3 A's that we're going to be discussing today, because we're going to be focusing on 3 different types of modification that were used during World War II. And the first one is adopt. Rob, can you tell us what adopt means?
Yeah, adopt means that you take something that was made for one purpose and you use it for another. So in this case, with World War II, we're talking about civilian technologies, things that people used in the regular world that were adapted for military use, adopted for military use.
And so to summarize that, when we adopt something, we're just modifying the use of an object. So we're taking something that has a use, right? And we're just kind of using it for something else.
Yeah.
Okay. So our next A is going to be adapt. Tell us more about adapt.
So adapt is when you're making more changes to it. So you have an idea, or you have something that you start with, but then you change it quite a bit. You change it up so that it fits your purpose better.
So when we adapt something, we're taking an object, we're making modifications to its design so that it's useful for another purpose.
Right.
Okay, and then our last A, our third A, is apply. Tell us more about that one.
So that's when we take knowledge that we've gained by doing some basic research, and we make something useful from it. So we learn something, and then we use what we learned to make something.
So when we apply, we're applying what we know to make an object even more useful than it already is.
Right, and these aren't mutually exclusive. That, you know, a lot of things are going to be blurred in between the two, or parts of 2 or more of these.
And Rob, we have a really good question that came in from Kelly. Kelly wants to know, since they didn't have smartphones back then, what did they use?
Well, that was one of the biggest changes from World War I to World War II. In World War I, they wanted to send a message. They actually used pigeons or something, you know, or a guy on a horse. And in World War II, they had radios that were reliable, but they were really big. I mean, a radio back then was the size of a generator today. Oh, or they also had phones that they could use within a short range. They could make a little phone network that would go about 7 miles, but they had to have actual wires going from one phone to the other. But other than that, it was radio.
And before we move on, we have another really good question about the ballpoint pens. Vanessa wants to know if the ballpoint pens that the soldiers were using to write letters home, if the ink was waterproof.
Yes, so it was, and they actually used, you know, it's a whole other topic, but you can get into V-mail, where the soldiers would write the letters, and then we would take photographs of it and shrink it down onto film really small and send that overseas, because it took a lot less energy to send that film overseas and make a new letter than to send the whole letter overseas.
Thank you. All right, so we just talked about the 3 A's: adopt, adapt, and apply. And what we are going to do with those 3 A's is we're going to take a trip into some of the exhibits here at the museum, and we're going to look at some of our macro artifacts. And macro artifacts are big artifacts, those huge things, okay? And we're going to look at how World War II innovators used these 3 A's to achieve victory for the Allied powers. And these 3 artifacts that we're going to be looking at, they actually represent some of the best innovations for use on the land, in the sea, and also in the air. And I want y'all to take a look at these 3 artifacts and be thinking about which of the 3 A's you think applies to each. And you can go ahead and type those responses into the question box, and we'll be looking at them while we're going through the next couple of segments, okay? But we're gonna get started with this macro artifact here. And we are actually going to go into the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion to learn a little bit more about it.
Hey guys, we're back in the museum in the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion. Behind me is the C-47 Skytrain. Now this plane is actually pretty similar to the commercial aircraft, the DC-3. The major additions were a cargo door, strengthened floor, and hooks to pull gliders. They were used during the war for transport of troops and cargo. About 10,000 were made by Douglas Aircraft during the war. They typically had a crew of 4 and could carry 27 others. This very aircraft flew paratroopers to France on and just after D-Day. C-47s delivered around 50,000 paratroopers for the invasion of Normandy. It also pulled the gliders that were very important on D-Day and other actions. The C-47 was powered by 2 of the famous Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. These radial engines have 14 cylinders with 1,200 horsepower each. The plane had a cruising speed of 160 miles per hour, could fly at 26,000 feet, and go as far as 1,600 miles before refueling. Like almost all other World War II aircraft, it didn't have a pressurized cabin, so it was very cold on board, and the crew and passengers had to use oxygen masks.
Okay, everyone, so we are back, and we just took a look at, Chrissy was telling us about that C-47 aircraft, okay? And that C-47 aircraft, as she told us, was a modified version of a commercial plane. And when we're talking about, looks like my screen is not sharing. Let me pull that back up. Okay, when we're talking about commercial aircraft, we're talking about those planes that were used to transport average citizens just like us. So think about whenever you go to the airport with your families and you're going on a trip. That's a commercial aircraft. But what you're seeing in this picture here, this is actually one of the commercial aircraft that the C-47 was a modified version of. This is that Douglas DC-3. And in this picture, we actually see that it's being used in a war film in 1943. So while the war was actually going on. And Rob, can you discuss how this plane was actually modified?
There was very little that was changed about it. They changed the seating inside so that it could accommodate paratroopers lined up along the 2 walls. They changed the door so that it was a cargo door instead of a swinging door like that. And they put a hook at the back of it so that it could pull gliders. But other than that, it really didn't change very much at all. They pretty much just used the same plane for a different purpose.
And this plane is very important. These planes are most well known probably for being used in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. So
if you come in the museum, this is the first thing you see pretty much when you come in the museum.
So let's take a look at some of the people who were actually on these planes. So we actually had 2 American paratrooper groups that were involved in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. And their job was to parachute behind German lines between midnight and about 3 a.m. on June 6th of 1944. And they were instructed to attempt to take roads and bridges so that when the beach invasion started, the Germans couldn't send out any reinforcements. And one of those two American groups was the 82nd Airborne Division. And you can see that they're actually all standing in front of a C-47. And this isn't all of them. This is just a very small group of them, because these planes, I mean, they're only so big. They can only hold so many people.
They hold about 26 people.
And let's take a look at the other American paratrooper group that was out there, the 101st Airborne Division. And in this photo, we're seeing that they are actually sitting inside of that C-47. And you talked about that modification that was.
So it's, if you've got a 90-pound pack and a parachute, you can't really sit in chairs like that. So they put them like this.
So in the question box, I would like for y'all to type in how many of these C-47 planes you think were actually used in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. And I'll give you a little bit of background information. So all in all, there were over 13,000 American paratroopers who were dropped into Normandy early morning on June 6th of 1944. So how many aircraft do you think were needed? I'll give you a second here, and then Rob, can you go ahead and reveal the answer of how many of these C-47s were actually used?
They used over 1,000 of them. So it seems like if you do the math, they would need 1,000. But remember that they had to drop all these guys just in 3 hours, and it took them a long time to fly back to England. But also, some of them were using, were pulling the gliders that dropped supplies and jeeps and big guns behind them too. So they used over 1,000 of these planes just on that one day.
So explain to us why modification was so important when we need over 1,000 planes.
Well, I mean, in this case, we need to make a lot really fast. And so making it perfect, making a lot of changes to it, starting from the ground up, that would take a lot of time. So instead, finding a plane that's really pretty much what you need and making a couple tweaks to it, that's a lot faster and easier.
And the next image that I'm going to share with you all, this is actually what all of these paratroopers dropping on D-Day would have actually looked like. And this is obviously not a D-Day picture because those drops were made when it was dark outside. But this is a really great example of what people would have seen if they looked up into the sky that night. And if you look up at the top of this picture here, you can actually see the silhouette of planes flying out. And in the D-Day invasion of Normandy, those planes were gonna have to fly out and head back to the airfield to collect even more paratroopers, right?
They picked guys up in England and flew across the channel and dropped them off and then had to go back.
All right, so now that we have discussed the C-47 and the modifications, we need to figure out which of the 3 A's we think applies here. And I'm gonna go back over what these mean. So adopt is when we are modifying the use of an object. And y'all can be typing in which one you think it is into the box while I discuss these. But when we adopt something, we're taking something that already has a use, right? And we're just using it for another purpose.
Right.
Adapt. When we adapt something, we're taking an object, we're making some modifications to its design, and we're making it useful for another purpose. And apply. When we apply, we're applying what we know to make an object even more useful than it already is. And I'm seeing some adopts coming in. Let's see, adapt and then apply just came in. Rob, can you reveal the answer to us?
I could see where adapt is coming from, but I would say adopt because there was very little change to the commercial aircraft. It's pretty much just a DC-3 with a paint job and some different seats.
Okay.
So pretty much we just used a commercial plane for another purpose.
Okay. All right. So we're going with adopt. We are using a commercial plane for a military purpose now, but I think we can definitely make an argument for the other ones. Like you said, we can see.
You make some adaptations, you change the seats, you change the door, but mostly, I mean, like I said, they are mutually exclusive. It's really, but it's primarily just taking a commercial plane. And that's one of the reasons why we could make these changes so quickly.
All right, so we have discussed our first macro artifact, the C47. Let's move on to our next macro artifact. This is our second artifact of the day, and I'm not going to reveal what it is because we're going to have Chrissy in the John E. Kushner Restoration Pavilion STEM and Innovation Gallery explain that to us. What a mouthful there with that name.
Hey guys, we're back in the STEM Innovation Gallery, and I'm standing by, well, you guessed it, this is a World War II ambulance. This was actually based on a Dodge truck, and it could fit a driver, of course, a medic, and up to 7 patients. It had a 6-cylinder engine, 4-wheel drive, and a 4-speed transmission. About 23,000 of these ambulances were made between 1942 and 1945. Many were given to Allied militaries for use. One thing that made this vehicle different from all other World War II vehicles, it had a heater. During the 1930s, medical scientists learned a lot about shock and trauma. One of the things they learned was that patients in shock needed to be kept warm. That's why the ambulance has a heater and insulated sidewalls. Other things medical scientists developed in the years leading up to World War II were antibiotics and freeze-dried blood plasma. Medics on these ambulances carried sulfa powder to fight infections and freeze-dried plasma that they can mix with bottles of sterile water to make IVs. Toward the end of the war, patients could also be treated with penicillin.
The PowerPoint back up here for you. So you can actually see an example of the Dodge truck that this was actually modified from. So we see that this is a civilian series Dodge truck here from the 1940s. And Dodge was really the biggest manufacturer of those ambulances, right?
Yep, they were the only ones that made the ambulances.
And we see that a lot of companies during the World War II years, they kind of halted what we call peacetime production, which is the things that they were producing while we weren't at war. And they started making things specifically for the war effort,
if you wanted a new car in 1942, you were out of luck. They didn't make them anymore.
So talk to us about the modifications that were made to this vehicle to get it to that ambulance.
So the main thing is that it was a panel truck, so it had the whole back closed in. And then really importantly, they added a heater and insulated sidewalls so that it would stay warm in the back of that ambulance. Now in the 1930s, they had figured out that when somebody's hurt really badly from trauma, they are going into shock, and what we need to do to treat them is we need to keep them warm. And we need to replace the blood that they've lost, because what happens is they've lost blood, and so all their circulation stays in the core of their body. They get really cold and they have really low blood pressure. So by keeping them warm and by replacing the blood fluids, we can help them out.
So you talked about replacing blood fluids, and that's actually what we see happening in the next image that I'm going to pull up on the screen here. So what's actually happening in this image here?
So he's actually giving them plasma, blood plasma. So there's a lot of problems with using blood in the battlefield. One is that blood has to be typed. So you have to know the soldier's type, and you need to know the type of blood, and you need to have a whole bunch of different kinds of types of blood to make sure that you have a match. And then blood has to be refrigerated to be kept preserved. And then you have to warm it up because you can't give it to them refrigerated. So that's just a big pain. Now they discovered in the 1930s that you could give somebody plasma. And so if you spin blood down, so that all the blood's on the bottom, the top liquid, the clear kind of yellowish liquid at the top is plasma. And they found that if you gave somebody blood plasma, it was almost as good as blood. And then they discovered that they could freeze dry plasma. So freeze dried, it didn't have to be refrigerated. So they shipped kits, medic kits over that would have freeze dried plasma.
And I actually have a picture of those kits that while you're talking, I'll pull that up so they can see it.
Okay. So they have a picture of it. And so you would open that up. And so in one can was a glass jar. They put them inside a can so they wouldn't break, of blood plasma freeze dried, and one of sterile water. They'd mix them together, shake it up just like Kool-Aid. And then they could give a life-saving blood transfusion.
So you brought up a good point. You said that one of these glass jars had water in it. And that brings me back to that heater that you said is inside the ambulance, because the European theater of the war, it was fought in wintry conditions, right?
It's very cold a lot of times.
If that water that was used to reconstitute the plasma was frozen, what would happen?
Right, you couldn't use it because you have to, the injection, the transfusion has to be really close to body temperature, or you can make shock worse. You could give the person hypothermia. So the heated ambulance would keep the patient warm, but it could also keep the blood plasma warm.
So the ambulance was really good for preventing shock in two ways, really, because it could keep your patients warm while they're being transported, but it could also prevent that water for your plasma kits from freezing.
Or getting really cold, yeah.
And we have a question from Megan B. Megan wants to know, if you receive plasma, would they still need a blood transfusion after that?
Yes, probably. It depends on how bad things were, but it gets up your blood fluid so that you could still circulate it all around, but it doesn't have blood cells in it, and it doesn't have the platelets that are gonna help you stop bleeding.
And before we move on, we have another really good question from Kelly again. Kelly wants to know what would happen if the wounded didn't receive the right type of blood. How would it affect their system? Would nothing happen, or would something happen?
Yeah, if you get a transfusion of the wrong type of blood, you'll have a severe immune reaction, and your body will attack those cells, and you'd likely die.
But this wasn't the case with plasma, right? Because all the red blood cells were removed from the plasma.
All the stuff that you could be allergic to is down here in the bottom.
Okay.
The blood cells and the platelets.
And the next thing I want to share is a picture of this doctor. He's really important to this whole story. Can you tell us more about who this is and why he's important?
This is Dr. Charles Drew. And when we were getting ready for the war, we weren't in it yet, but England was getting bombed every night in 1940. We were collecting blood to send over there, blood drives, because tens of thousands of British people in the cities were killed and many more were injured. And so we were sending blood over there. And Charles Drew was in charge of that effort to get that blood and preserve it and send it over there. So when we were getting ready for getting into the war ourselves, they put Charles Drew in charge of the process of freeze drying the blood and making these kits. We couldn't have like every state doing it a different way. We had to have one centralized way to collect the blood, to process the blood into freeze dried plasma, and then to package it together. And he was the guy in charge of all that huge effort. And he was later in charge of the United States Red Cross, and he actually resigned from that very important position after the war because he was African American, and he was very concerned that the Red Cross had a policy of giving blood only to the same race as the person who gave it. So if you were Black, they would look for Black person's blood. Now, biologically, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, and that seems kind of counterproductive if you're trying to save lives to separate the blood.
So he said this is wrong, and he resigned. It was a very was a very honorable thing to do.
And we have some, let me pull these questions out. We're getting some really good questions about plasma. So the first one that I saw here was from Jack, and Jack wants to know how they get the plasma into the body. So Jack, I'm gonna share again this image of a soldier actually in the European theater of the war giving that plasma transfusion. So it would be similar to a blood transfusion, right?
Yeah, it's an IV. Just like a blood transfusion would be, but it's just an IV. They stick it into a vein and then they hang it and gravity pulls it down into your blood.
And Aiden wants to know if there are different types of plasma, just like there are different types of blood.
Nowadays, we do have different types of plasma. They might be enriched in this thing or that thing, but back then they just had one kind of plasma. And they ended up stopping the use of plasma for a while after World War II because they found that they were accidentally transmitting hepatitis that way. Hepatitis is a virus that, among other things, attacks your liver. They didn't know that much about viruses back then, and they didn't know that this was going to happen. So when they found that it was happening, they stopped using plasma transfusions for a while. But they've found ways to take care of that now.
And that actually answers Lori's question a little bit, who wanted to know, do we still use plasma today? And Lori, I can tell you that after World War II, the United States military stopped using plasma for the reasons Rob just told us. They discovered that hepatitis was being transmitted to people, but we saw that other countries, as science improved, they started using plasma again. And now I've seen quite a few articles popping up within the past few years where our military has actually started using dried plasma again. But right now, I think the donations are still coming from foreign countries. But that brings us to another question. That was, where did the donated plasma come from? And it actually came from the people that were here on the home front, just regular Americans like you and me. And we still see today that people go out to the blood center and they donate blood to help their communities. And that blood donation, that's where the actual plasma comes from. And whenever I was in college, when all of my friends needed a little extra money, they would donate their plasma too.
Yeah, they use plasma for special medical conditions and stuff too. But yeah, every time there's a big, natural disaster or something, people go and there's a blood drive, because injured people need the blood and blood products.
And before we get to our adopt, adapt, apply, which I'm going to throw that up on the screen so y'all can be typing in what you think the ambulance is while I'm still talking. We had one last question about plasma from Nathan, who wanted to know, what color is the plasma?
It's kind of a clear yellowish liquid. We do a thing that looks just like plasma here. We put tomato juice. And if you use V8 juice and you spin it in a centrifuge, it looks a lot like blood, and the stuff at the top looks a lot like plasma. So we do that as a demonstration here.
So let's go back to our adopt, adapt, apply. So we want to hear, we're talking about that Dodge ambulance, and we want to hear whether you think it is adopt. And remember, when we adopt something, we're taking an object that has a use, but we're using it for another purpose. Adapt is when we take an object and we make modifications to its design to make it useful for another purpose. And apply, when we apply, we're applying what we know to make an object even more useful than it already is. And oh, look, Tony said apply with an explanation point behind it. Yeah. We're getting a mix of everything. We're getting mostly adapts and applies here. But Rob, can you tell us what the answer is?
So, I could see all of them again, but this is like, use your ELA skills. Like, what's the main point of this story? And to me, the main point of this story is apply. We learned about shock and trauma and how to treat people, and we turned that into a new ambulance and a system for getting people the blood plasma that they needed. So I would say apply is what I would I would say is the label for this story.
But again, like you said, with the the C47.
I mean, we kind of adopted a truck and we adapted it to work. But like I said, the main theme is apply.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you all for your responses. And
you guys are doing great.
Yeah, y'all are doing a great job. And I want to shout out Betsy Almarico's students. Hey, thank y'all for watching. All right, let's go on to our third and final macro artifact for the day. And it's this big behemoth that we see in front of us.
It's a fun thing.
We're going to go back into the STEM and Innovation Gallery to hear from Chrissy one last time about this particular innovation here.
Hey guys, this is Chrissy in the STEM Innovation Gallery in the museum. I'm standing here next to the LVT-4 Water Buffalo. This is an amphibious armored vehicle that was used to bring troops ashore in the Pacific Theater during World War II. This version weighs about 16.5 tons and carries about 30. It rides low in the water, propelled only by the cups on the metal tracks. In water, it goes no more than 5 miles per hour. On land, it can go up to 25. The original design for this came from a hurricane rescue vehicle designed by an inventor in Florida. He called it the Alligator, and the military version was often given that nickname. It was modified for military use and made by the Food Machinery Corporation, who made agriculture equipment before the war. About 8,500 of this model were made. The tracks on these allowed them to cross the coral reefs surrounding volcanic islands in the Pacific, like Saipan and Iwo Jima, and crawl ashore under fire with soldiers protected inside. It has a door in the back so they can exit under cover.
Chrissy brought up something very important about this macro artifact that we call the LVT. She said that it was originally designed as a hurricane rescue vehicle. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because we are actually here on the Gulf Coast of the United States, where we deal with a hurricane season from June all the way through November. Okay, so this is a major weather issue affecting the entire Gulf Coast. And actually, the guy who invented the Alligator, he was from Florida, and I believe his grandfather or his great-grandfather was also.
His grandparents worked on building the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, so this was in his blood, but he was living in Florida, and he saw Florida get hit with terrible hurricanes in 1926, 1928, 1932, and 1935. So in 1933, this inventor, whose name was Donald Roebling, he started working to design an amphibious tractor. An amphibious, that means that it can go on the land and also in the water, to rescue victims of Florida's hurricanes who were trapped in swampy areas. And like Chrissy told us, he called this invention the Alligator. And I want to show y'all what the Alligator actually looked like. It was pretty cool. So it looks pretty similar to the LVT that we showed you. But the U.S. Marine Corps, they actually came across this invention, right, Rob, when they were searching for a vehicle that could do what?
In 1935, there was a terrible hurricane. They call it the Labor Day hurricane of Florida. And it killed hundreds of people, and people got stuck, and some of them died just because they couldn't get rescued. And so when they used this to rescue people, they made a page of Life magazine, which was the magazine everybody read back then. It was a big magazine with pretty pictures. They had lots of pictures of this. This actually comes from that magazine. And the military saw it and said, hey, I think we can use something like that. Now, they had landing vehicles, of course, but the landing vehicles were wood. So they knew if they needed to get across a coral reef, that the wood would get ripped apart by the coral. Now this thing gets propelled only by the tracks. There's those cups on the tracks, like Chrissy said, that push it through the water. There's no propeller. So it was really good for crawling across those coral reefs and then getting to the rest of those islands, because those islands are volcanoes with a coral reef around it in a ring.
Okay, so before we move on, we just got a really good question from Alan, who wants to know the difference between the Higgins boat and the Alligator, or the LVT.
I'm so glad you asked. So a Higgins boat is like this, and so it's actually a modified fishing boat. So it's got a similar situation. where it's modified from a fishing boat. The first one didn't have a door. The second one, they put a door in it. So that the LVT is similar, except that this gets we don't have a propeller on it, but the Higgins boat has a big propeller on it that pushes it through the water. And the LVT, it's those tracks going around that scoop with their little cups and push it through the water. This is wood, and the LVT is steel.
And I imagine the Higgins boat went a little bit faster than the LVT.
Quite a bit faster. This goes like up to 20, 25 miles an hour in the water. That went 5, you know. This is pretty heavy, but the LVT weighs 16.5 tons.
Wow. And that brings us to David's question. David actually wants to know, if it's so heavy, how does it float in the water?
Do we have a picture of how low it floats?
We don't.
So you can kind of see it in that other shot, I think.
And this one here, let's take a look.
Yeah, back.
So they float really low, and I think they showed it in the video.
Yeah.
So it floats really low in the water, like right at the top of the tracks. And it's a kind of a wet experience. Since you're so low, it splashes a lot. There's a little bit of leakage through that door because it's metal on metal. So it's kind of a wet experience, but it does float even though it weighs 16.5 tons.
It's a monster.
Yeah.
I understand why they call it the water buffalo.
If you want to know why it floats, we have an old webinar called What Floats Your Boat. You can look that one up.
So this picture that I put up on the screen, this one is actually pretty important to the LVT story and also the World War II story as a whole, because the Marines, they actually used LVTs to invade this island called Iwo Jima. Yep. And Iwo had about 3 airfields, and it was only about 700 miles from Japan. And we were going to launch some aerial attacks on Japan. We needed our B-29 bombers to be able to head over there and drop bombs. So it was a really big deal to get control of this teeny tiny little island that was surrounded by coral and was a volcanic island, right?
Yep. So we would say that the volcano Mount Suribachi there was dormant, which means it wasn't active, but the whole island itself was active. I mean, it's got this black sand that's from volcanic rock. And so if you're coming up on the beach, it's this black coarse sand, and the beach is hot. This volcano produces steam. It's got a lot of water coming up through it. So it's like this foggy, hot, wet. So imagine being some 19-year-old guy from Kansas or Massachusetts, and you're crawling up that beach. Back then, they didn't know where volcanoes came from or what caused them. So that would have been really weird.
And Rob mentioned Mount Suribachi, which is that mountain kind of in the distance there. And that was the highest point on this teeny tiny little island that was only 4 miles long at its longest point and about 2 miles wide at its widest point. Mount Suribachi was about 528 feet high. 528 feet high. And the reason why I wanted to point this out is because many of you have probably seen this image. This image is actually on top of Mount Suribachi. This was taken on February 23rd of 1945. And we see 6 Marines raising the United States flag. And this was taken by a photographer named Joe Rosenthal. And to give you a little perspective, the Battle of Iwo Jima, these LVTs start pulling in on about February 19th. This flag was raised on February 23rd, but the battle did not completely end. Like, we didn't take this full island until March 26th. So this battle was like a month long, right? And this image is so important because it became kind of like a rallying cry here in the United States of America. This is actually a propaganda poster that was used to raise money for war bonds. But people, they saw this image here in the United States and they became more motivated and they got excited because they were like, the war feels like it's almost over. And just interesting fact about this image, there are 6 guys who were identified as raising this flag, but one had actually been misidentified until not that long ago. We originally thought that John Bradley was a part of this, but some history buffs, like I think they were just amateur researchers doing it for fun, they realized that the 6th guy was actually a man named Harold Schultz. So let's see if we have any more questions about the LVT here. I think we had one where Sophia asked if we still use these today in hurricanes. I haven't seen that.
We don't use them in hurricanes. The military uses something today they call an Amtrak, which is basically the same thing, or a Bradley they used in Vietnam. They're actually made by the same company, the Food Manufacturing Corporation that Chrissy mentioned in the video. They still made those for Vietnam War.
Okay, so maybe like a modified version of the LVT still being used today. And that brings us back to the 3 A's here. So type in your answers while I'm reviewing what these mean. Remember, adopt is when we take something that has a use, but we use it for another purpose. Adapt, when we adapt something, we are taking an object and making modifications to its design to make it useful for another purpose. And apply, when we apply, we're applying what we know to make an object even more useful than it already is. And we're getting some answers in, and it looks like right now everybody is saying adapt. So Rob, can you reveal the answer?
Yeah, I would definitely say adapt, because we took this idea of the thing that Roebling made, and we said that concept works, but we really need to make some changes to it. Roebling's thing was made of aluminum. We need to make it heavier and stronger, and so that's what they did. They adapted it. So I think you guys get the concept really, really good.
And to wrap this up, before we go to our final Q&A session, Rob, I'd like you to really elaborate on why modification was so important for the United States, for us to be successful in this war.
So first of all, modification is just what engineers and scientists do. You come up with an idea, you test it out, you make it better, you test it out, you make it better until you run out of money. That's just what you do. But second of all, like we say in the essay, we had to get ready for this war really, really quickly. We were starting in 1939, 1940 to get ready, but very slowly. You know, when we got into the war, when the Japanese kind of pulled us into the war with Pearl Harbor, we definitely were not prepared for what was to come, but we won. And we did it because we just made a lot of stuff. And that's a big part of it. There were brave people and people worked hard, but a lot of it was that we just made a lot of stuff. And we did it by being really smart about production. And part of that means not starting from scratch, but taking what you have and modifying it or making it better.
Thank you, Rob. And the last thing I want to discuss before we answer the rest of these questions that we have, we do have 2 activities that Rob has prepared for your students. And can you tell us a little bit more about what they are?
Yeah, so one of them is just practicing that iterative process of testing and modifying and testing and modifying. You're going to make paper airplanes and you're going to test them. And then you're going to decide, do I want to make it go further? Do I want to make it go faster? Do I want to make it carry more? And you're going to try to make some tweaks to it and test it out to see how it does, and keep doing that over and over again until you get a better airplane. The second one is about the assembly line process. Now, we think of modifying things, but we don't always think about modifying processes. The assembly line process is a thing itself that could be modified. And so in this case, what you're going to do is you're going to use ballpoint pens to make an assembly line. You're going to take these clickable ballpoint pens apart and see if you can put them together quickly with an assembly line. And then you're going to modify your assembly line and try faster and faster to put it together. And so those 2 are provided with your with the lessons that we handed
And
out.
teachers, if y'all do the activities, we would love for you to tweet
We would love it.
pictures to us. And I have that included in the teacher guide. But our Twitter handle is at WWII Education. And again, that's included in your guide, so you don't have to write that down now. And then this is for the teachers. If you liked Rob and you found him informative and entertaining, you need to sign up for Real World Science. Rob, tell them what that is.
So if you are here close by in Louisiana, you can bring your students on a STEM field trip into the STEM Innovation Gallery. But whether you are or not, if you're a 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th grade teacher, you can come to Real World Science. If part of your day is teaching science, I want you to come, be one of 28 people to come to the museum. You're going to spend a week learning how to do hands-on activities like this, figuring out why boats float using Higgins boats, and going to LIGO, which is where they figured out how to measure gravitational waves. It's a great week, and we pretty much pay for everything. Come down here, spend a week, have a great time, get 200 pages of lessons and activities and readings for your students.
And you can find the information for this on our website. If you can't find it, just send me an email and I can email the direct link to you.
It's nationalworldwar2museum.org/Real World Science, all one word.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I want to get to some of these last questions. Mike wants to know if you have a favorite book about World War II problem solving.
You know, there's a lot of great books. One book that's good for students at this age level that I really like is Bomb by Steve Sheinkin, and we actually did a webinar last year with him. And he talks about all the problems that they solved this is the book, it's a great book. It has really good descriptions of nuclear power and how it worked and how the bomb worked. It's very kind of exciting because there's at the same time this espionage story about people stealing the Manhattan Project story. You can go back in history and see the recording of that webinar if you want, but that's a really good book. I give it to all the teachers, a copy to all the teachers in Real World Science. I think for this age level, that's my favorite book about World War II problem solving.
Okay, Devin wants to know if the United States had better technology than other countries.
You know, to some extent, I would say that yes and no. Our radar was way better than the German or the Japanese. Mm-hmm. But like, for example, their tanks were way better than ours.
And the British and the Germans, they had jet aircraft,
They had jet aircraft. We still had that. So one of our solutions, again, was that, you know, sometimes they had better tech than we did, but we made, like with the Panzers, people like to talk about their Panzer tanks. The German Panzer tanks were way better than ours, but we made a lot more of them.
All right, Rainier High School wants to know about any additional plane technology from World War II. And I just mentioned the jet engines, but was there anything else?
Superchargers. So for planes to be able to go up really high in the atmosphere, there's not a lot of air pressure up there. And so a supercharger takes the exhaust and uses it to drive a fan to blow air into your engine. Today, you'll see cars that are turbocharged. That's a modification of a supercharger. That was one. The B-29 had a pressurized cabin. Everybody else, you know, they were just up there really cold and breathing through an air mask. Is that Rainier in in Washington?
I thought they said they were Oregon. Let me see.
Okay.
Well, while we wait for Christy to get us that answer, let's see. Kelly with another really good question. Were women allowed to join the war? Did they help build these weapons?
Well, definitely women were involved in building. You know, Rosie was famous, but lots and lots of women were on assembly lines. But also there were women that trained pilots because they were really good. They were really good pilots themselves. And they weren't necessarily, they weren't able to fly in combat, but they flew planes to and from landing strips to transport them around, and they also trained pilots. And they learned how to do radar, and then they turned around and taught pilots and other guys how to do radar.
All right, and our last question, because I see we have people leaving the room and it is about 1 minute after our time. This one comes from Emily, and Emily wants to know what recycled product the military used the most. And I don't know if we know the exact answer,
No.
but if I had to make a guess, I would think that rubber was probably really big on the list, because we didn't have access to the rubber plants out in the Pacific, because our enemy, Japan, they had control of all the islands in the Pacific. They were kind of controlling the seas out there.
We also made a lot of gunpowder from recycled waste fats. So that might be a big one too, because all those munitions, a lot of them were made from recycled waste fats.
Yeah, so.
But everything was recycled. I mean, the boxes that they put bombs in, the paper, like we were really into recycling back then. Let's do it again.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you for, interacting with us so much. It made it that much better.
You're really busy.
And Rob, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise. Thank you, Chrissy, for giving us that information in the galleries. And thank you again to everyone. We hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.
Stay in touch.
Bye.